Thank you for joining our webinar on trusted publishing versus predatory journals. What does it mean for the integrity of science? My name is Marita Eleftheriadou, Project Manager for Researcher Academy. I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Flavian Stoker. Dr. Stoker obtained his Bachelor of Science and Master of Science from the University of Bucharest and his PhD from the University of Florence. His previous expertise as scientific researcher is in the field of optics, lasers, plasma, and spectroscopy, with applications in material science. Having previously collaborated with Elsevier as external managing editor for the journal Applied Surface Science, Dr. Stoker joined Elsevier in 2022 as scientific editor, and since 2024, his role is that of publishing ethics expert. On the call today, we also are joined by Angela Welch, Policy and Guidelines Manager within the Research Integrity and Publishing Ethics team. Angela has over 13 years of experience in scholarly publishing and has dealt with a fair share of publishing ethics-related cases during her time as a publisher of physics and health and medical sciences journals, and as a team lead for our scientific managing editors who oversee our article transfer service. Angela will be on hand today to help with the Q&A session. I will now hand it over to Flavian.
Thank you, Marita, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. This Research Academy presentation is dedicated to the very popular topic of predatory journals. But before we go into that, a few words should be said about what is a trusted publisher as opposed to a predatory publisher. Now, this slide gives perhaps one of the most oversimplified pictures of the scientific publishing cycle. Researchers use the funds that are provided to them by various institutions, and the results of their research are disseminated to the scientific communities that they are part of. This happens through websites, at scientific conferences, but more often than not, researchers will compile the results of their work in the form of manuscripts that they submit to scientific journals, where these manuscripts are usually peer-reviewed, and if all goes well, they get published. Funders will evaluate the performance of their researchers and research institutions, either by considering the end product, the scientific article, but again, more often than not, funders will rely on third parties that provide metrics provided by abstracting services and indexation databases, such as Web of Science and Scopus. This cycle relies critically on the mutual trust of the involved stakeholders. All stakeholders in the scientific community have a moral obligation to uphold the integrity of research and dissemination of its results. The value of this endeavor of enriching human knowledge and the quality of life through scientific research relies on this relationship of trust. So, what does it take to be a trusted author? Some of you, maybe first-time authors, some of you may be more experienced, but I think in general, you will know that the manuscripts that you submit to different journals will be screened for various issues. These are issues that have to do either with the way in which the submissions are compiled, but they also have to do with upholding ethical standards. And there are some common ethical pitfalls that authors should be aware of, such as plagiarism, image or data manipulation, unsubstantiated authorship claims, citation manipulation, missing ethical approvals especially for health and medical sciences research, undeclared conflicts of interest, or duplicate submissions that are usually not condoned by the major publishers. And finally, this is a more trendy topic, but we're not going to discuss this in this presentation, the inappropriate use of generative AI tools. In order to avoid such pitfalls, any trusted publisher will recommend their authors to first and foremost follow the now pretty extensive guide for authors that journals have. And it's important to do this because some of the guidelines that manuscripts must follow are very journal specific. But they also should comply with broader ethics policies that publishers have. And I've given you here a link for the policies that Elsevier has. And also they preferably, if they still have time in their busy schedule, to stay informed on the latest and in publishing and ethical standards. And you can find out about these things on Elsevier's Researcher Academy platform. Of course, there are also other third-party platforms that provide such information. What does it take to be a trusted publisher? Well, here it gets a little difficult because first of all, there's no single organization or body that has jurisdiction in saying what qualifies as a trusted publisher. Having said that, there are some bodies in the scientific communities, most of our non-profit organizations or associations, and some of the most respected of these are the Committee on Publishing Ethics, the Directory of Open Access Journals, the Open Access Scholarly Publishing Association, and the World Association of Medical Editors. And these four bodies have collaborated to compile a set of guidelines referred to as the principles of transparency and best practice in scholarly publishing. This is at its this document is already at its sort of a fourth iteration. It's at its fourth version, and this document outlines what are the basic principles that publishers should respect in order to qualify as trusted publishers. Um, and some of these principles are, I've sort of handpicked a few of them here. I only present a few of them that they are very illustrative of what is expected of a publisher toward upholding trust in the published record. The journal name, first of all, it must be unique and it must be one that is not easily confused with another journal. The website must be professional, secure. The journal should have an international serial number. There must be clear archiving plans for the content for long-term digital preservation. The copyright terms should be clear. The licensing terms should be clear. Perhaps most importantly, in terms of publication ethics, principles and policies must be clearly described and in line, preferably with COPE ethics guidelines. Peer review is another one of the fundamental principles on which trust in the published record is preserved. So the statements of peer review times should be supported by published time frames on accepted papers, and most of all, the editors and the journal stakeholders should ensure that the peer review is fair and impartial, free of conflicts of interest, and free of ethical misconduct, either from the part of editors or reviewers. The editorial team, for the editorial team, full names and affiliations of the journal's editors should be displayed, as well as their contact information. Again, when it comes to open access publishing, when we talk about publishing charges, this again must be clearly stated, transparent, and the authors should easily have access to them prior to submitting their manuscripts for review. So publishers committed to the guardianship over the scholarly record will work towards upholding these principles. And if you look on Elsevier websites, I've given a few links here that you can access afterwards. Elsevier has defined a clear set of policies and standards that apply to all of the submissions that it processes, and it applies to the workflow of all of its journals. And there are also a set of publishing ethics principles outlined as the duties of the publisher, which are given at a different link. So Elsevier is trying to be as transparent as possible in its handling of the submissions that it receives, and it outlines that these are handled in line with these principles of the trusted publishing. Now that I've explained what are the principles of trusted publishing, perhaps it's not that difficult to try and formulate what constitute predatory publishing practices. So what are predatory publishers or journals? Now, predatory publishing is an exploitative business model in which authors are misled. And misled is an important word here because this is what defines the behavior, the predatory behavior. Predatory journals will mislead authors to publish their works in their journals, usually asking for a fee that is small and with the promise of unrealistically fast peer review times in journals that do not provide the high quality editorial and publishing services that are expected of a trusted publishers. It's true that historically the concept of predatory publishing emerged through a list that was published by Jeffrey Beal, who was a librarian at the University of who is a librarian at the University of Colorado, and he defined these publishers' journals as ones that exploit the open access model in which the author pays. But this list was discontinued a while ago. There are some sort of bootlegged versions still circulating of it on the internet, but it has become less of a practice to label publishers as predatory based on criteria or lists that were drafted by a single individual. And it's easy to see why that happened. It's because these individuals may not disclose the exact methodology that they used in labeling publishers as predatory, and often they have non-declared conflict, or they may not have undeclared conflicts of interest in making up that list. So stakeholders in the scientific community nowadays are strongly encouraged to familiarize themselves with the principles of trusted publishing that I've mentioned earlier, and to work together in deciding the extent to which a publisher can be considered either trustworthy or predatory, depending on their alignment with these principles. Um, so considering the previously presented principles of trusted publishing, one can identify some of the hallmarks characteristic to predatory publishing. We mentioned the journal name, that it must be unique and not easily confused with other journals, but predatory publishers will mimic the name of well-known journals and will mislead authors on that. Website must be professional and secure. Well, predatory publishers, sure, in time they've polished their websites, but a lot of them still have poor quality websites. The information that they present is far from misleading. They often present made-up metrics such as universal impact factor, Google impact factor, or on the contrary, they present that their journal has a legitimate impact factor when in fact it doesn't have one. And this is also very particular for journals that mimic the names of well-known journals. And one other very interesting aspect, if you go on any journal from Elsevier, you will easily be able to tell who the publisher of that journal is. If you go on a predatory publisher's web page, you will have a very hard time finding who is actually the publisher of that journal. Archiving, of course, a lot of trusted publishers will invest a lot of resources in long-term digital preservation of the published content, whereas predatory journals have absolutely no plans for the preservation of the published record. The copyright terms for and the licensing terms for the content that are presented on the websites should be clearly visible and stated, whereas for predatory journalists there is a lack of clarity about content ownership and licensing. As for the other things, publishing ethics, let's just say that predatory journals are not members of COPE. They're not members of the Committee on Publishing Ethics, although it should be said that not all journals who are not members of COPE are predatory. It's easy to see how someone can launch a journal, and it will take a while for them to develop the necessary workflows and methods and tools that will allow for them to be either indexed in abstracting services, or to be accepted for indexation in Web of Science and get an impact factor, but also to become members of COPE, which has very stringent requirements on the appropriateness of the ethical procedures that a journal must follow. Peer review, again, a very important aspect. It should be stated that the biggest flaw of predatory journals is the fact that the peer review is very often fake. There's no peer review, there's no peer reviewers. They might simulate peer review, or they might use peer reviewers that are very favorable in order to accept the manuscript as fast as possible. Authors should be very cautious when a journal web page entices them with very short peer review times, like a few days, or guaranteed peer review times. Like someone could guarantee you what the peer review time will be. The editorial team is clearly stated for trusted journals. And this is another thing that is characteristic to predatory journals. They will list editors who they sometimes don't list clearly the editors, or sometimes they hijack identity of well-known editors and just put them on their website as to sort of reassure submitting authors that they have recognizable editors on their editorial boards, when in fact they don't. Does not mention publishing charges. A lot of authors who submit papers to predatory journals find out that they have to pay a fee later on after their manuscript has been accepted, and this happens without having been informed in advance. Regarding the proliferation and impact of predatory publishing, so after seeing these hallmarks of predatory publishers, one might ask, well, how is it possible, or why do predatory journals even exist? I mean, can't we just shut them down? Wouldn't everyone want to publish in a trusted scientific journal? Well, yes or no. The truth is that, first of all, there's no international authority, like as it is for trusted publishing. There's no international authority that can sort of shut down predatory journals. And unfortunately, there are factors and enablers that allow predatory journals to coexist alongside trusted journals. First of all, there's pressure to publish related to tenure, promotion, grants. A lot of authors who try to publish in trusted journals and might get rejected a few times, might be disappointed with the outcomes of the peer review at these journals, and might be enticed to publish in predatory journals because the bar for acceptance there is much lower or inexistent. Again, publication times, which are asserted to be much shorter in predatory journals, might entice authors who are facing deadlines for reporting. Of course, there's also the aspect of authors falling victim to targeted marketing messages promising unrealistically low publishing charges and very fast time to publication. For any researcher who's worked at least 1 year or two, you will start to get in your spam box, in your email, at least weekly or maybe daily, invitations to predatory conferences or invitations to submit to predatory journals. Is just a fact of life. I still get them daily in my personal email account. And let's not forget that predatory journals are a platform for authors who have no interest in cultivating trust in scientific publishing. Of all the things that I mentioned here, of course, the only one that it seems to be, the misleading part is the fourth, whereas many of the others are actually due to people who enable the existence and proliferation of predatory journals, which ultimately has a very negative impact overall. So the greatest damage that is done by predatory publishing is that it erodes trust in science and scientific publishing. Those things that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. So what are the implications of that? Well, flawed research results that end up being published because of inexistent or low quality peer review can have a direct negative impact on individuals. And you can think here of health and medical journals where they might publish inaccurate information regarding patient treatments or certain drugs that don't work the way they do, or made up drugs. And, people who might want to test these out will test them out relying on falsehoods. You can think of engineering procedures that applied in industry may have a risk on the life of workers. And there are many such other examples that can detrimentally affect the state of individuals based on these false results. Scientifically inaccurate content can contribute to the proliferation of misinformation. I won't talk too much about that. You know very well what happened during the COVID pandemic when there was a flurry of misinformation that it took a while to settle, or maybe it hasn't completely. Ultimately, what will happen is that decreased public support toward the funding of scientific research will result in fewer improvements in the quality of life of the communities that we serve. And that's really a pity, and that is ultimately what we all want to avoid. Of course, when considering the impact that predatory publishing can have on authors directly, things are quite simple, and every author should give this proper consideration. You should keep in mind that a track record that displays publications in questionable sources can limit the prospects for employment at reputable institutions. I mean, they will look at your CVs, and if they find authors who have published extensively in these dubious sources, it's natural that they won't be the first candidates for those jobs. And it also impacts the chances of authors acting as editors at trusted journals, or being invited as speakers at prestigious conferences. So what can we do to combat predatory publishing practices and the proliferation of predatory journals? I will start with the publishers here. Um, well, trusted publishers, first of all, we cannot label other publishers as predatory. I will be not calling names during this presentation. A trusted publisher will disclose always a conflict of interest, and I have to disclose a conflict of interest. We have conflicts of interest with all other publishers since we're competing, let's say, for the same content. And therefore, I cannot point fingers at other publishers and say, this one is predatory, this one is predatory. But what we can do, we can from time to time organize webinars such as this one, or present similar content on Researcher Academy, in which we raise awareness about the dangers that predatory publishing poses and what its consequences over the long term in terms of damaging trust in science. What funders can do? Well, this is different. Actually, funders can do a lot. Funders, they are in the position to either deny the payment of publishing charges to publishers with questionable practices, or they are in the position to tell authors of researchers that they fund to tell, well, you are not supposed to publish in these journals and these journals and these journals. If you publish in them, we're either not paying for the fee, or the fact that you authored papers in these journals will not count towards your career advancement. So actually, funders can do a lot. And as much as possible, we highly encourage authors to go to their funders and ask for clarity in terms of what journals they expect them to publish in. So yeah, funders can provide authors with clear guidelines regarding the quality of journals in which they should publish their research. And some funders actually do. I've heard that it's a phenomenon that gains traction, and I'm happy that it does so, but it's still quite limited. And as much as possible, we'd like for every funder to tell their researchers where they should publish, and especially where they should not publish. So what abstracting and indexation services can do? So as you may know, abstracting and indexation services, they regularly review the activity of the journals that they index in their databases. Journals still get included, in the Web of Science and on the COPE website if they fulfill the necessary criteria either for indexation or for keeping a clean editorial office. And conversely, if there are sufficient complaints from the community and sufficient deficiencies are exposed at these journals, they can be de-indexed from the Web of Science, or they can be kicked out of COPE, or they can be penalized otherwise. There are other bodies watching as well, such as the Chinese Academy of Science. They also conduct a yearly review of journals who have questionable practices brought forward by the scientific communities who report these things. It should be mentioned, though, that predatory journals, even de-indexed and delisted, can continue to exist even without any recognition from the stakeholders in the scientific community. And they can continue to pose a threat and try to mislead authors in submitting their content to them. By far, authors um, have the largest influence over the proliferation of predatory publishing. Um, I think these are things that have been stated before, but I will restate them. The most obvious of one of them being, do you trust? In determining whether to trust a journal or not, the easiest thing to do is to ask a colleague who has whether they have heard of that journal, or whether they trust that journal, or whether they know someone who trusts that journal. So this relationship of trust should proliferate and should establish and should count a lot in deciding on whether you want to publish in a journal or not. You can ask yourself, well, is the journal in line with the principle of transparency and best practice in scholarly publishing that I just mentioned? So there is a website for that. That's called Think, Check, Submit. And if you enter this website, you'll see a sort of a questionnaire where they ask you, well, what do you know of this about the journal? Does this journal show this? Does it fulfill this criteria? And in checking those boxes, it helps you decide whether that journal is sufficiently trustworthy to you or not. But what I would consider sort of a simple life hacks, as a best practice, when you prepare your manuscript, the first thing in order to stop the proliferation of predatory journals, the first thing to do is not publishing them, but not to cite them. So my first advice is, do not cite questionable or unreliable sources, even if these sources sort of tend to agree with the results of your research. If they're published in questionable journals, don't use them, because citing such sources not only proliferates the outreach of questionable content, but it can have a pretty decisive role in having your manuscript rejected by trusted journals. Editors can look over the manuscript, and very often they look over the references, and if they see questionable sources in there, you might just get rejected just for that, just for using some references, some sources that are not up to the standard of a trusted journal. The easiest thing to do is, after you've prepared your manuscript, is to make a short list of 3, maybe 5 of the most cited sources in your manuscript, and consider submitting your paper with those journals or publisher. And this will help you also align with the scope of the respective journals. Ultimately, you have to be pragmatic about your long-term goals, and that is to choose to publish in journals that are trusted and that will provide you with better career opportunities. Oh, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Well, this may be a bit of a cliche, but it's yet again true. First and foremost, authors should try to avoid falling victims to promises of unrealistically fast and guaranteed peer review times. This is perhaps one of the main arguments that predatory journals will still leverage in enticing authors to submit their works to them. Indeed, trusted journals, despite their better efforts to improve peer review times, will take as long as needed to carry out a manuscript evaluation process that aligns with industry standards and guidelines, such as those of the Committee on Publishing Ethics, in order to ensure that trust in the published record is upheld. I will close by presenting a few of the resources that authors can use in their journey to avoid predatory publishers. First of all, is this website I told you about, Think, Check, Submit. It's easy to enter this website, check a few boxes by also checking out in parallel the web pages of the journals that you want to submit to, and see, if that journal uh, is trustworthy to you or not. Again, I will not put here a blacklist of predatory publishers that you might find, I don't know where on the internet, because you don't know who's behind that list. You don't know how that list was made based on what criteria. If it's just a random list of thrown in publishers there, how much of that can you really trust? There are other in-depth guidelines and matrices for the evaluation of predatory risks, and one of these is published by the Dutch Consortium of University Libraries. There are also the principles of transparency and best practice in scholarly publishing that I mentioned to you about. And it's also easy to search to see if a publisher is a member of COPE. Again, if it's not a member of COPE, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's predatory. But if it is a member of code, then you can pretty much trust that it is a trusted publisher. And here the interesting part is that when you enter the web page of a predatory journal, the first thing you're going to notice is that you'll have a very hard time finding the name of the publisher. So never mind entering the publisher's name on the COPE website, but just trying to look for the publisher is going to take you some effort, and that alone should ring some alarm bells. So think of that when you hunt for the next predatory publisher, or better yet, try to avoid it. This is the end of my presentation, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Flavian. Thank you. That was an excellent presentation. Let's proceed with the Q&A section of the webinar. So over to you.
Excellent. Okay, there have been some questions coming in. I will do my best to address as many of these as we can. So we have a question that pertains to checking references that are being cited within our papers, and how do we know whether or not that reference is reliable or not? Are there any different tools that we can use to do some quick checks and make sure that there's no problems that have been identified with a particular reference?
Well, I myself, as a publishing ethics expert, rely on a very famous third-party tool called PubPeer. I strongly recommend, PubPeer. I'm not going to say that everything that's said on PubPeer is a valid ethics concern, but then again, I strongly encourage each and every one of you to develop your own skills in judging these concerns. And you can always enter the DOI, the digital object identifier of a paper, on PubPeer. And there it will show, whether the paper has comments from the community or not. Other than that, deciding on whether a paper has been published, a source is published in a predatory journal, I would browse a little through that journal and try to see what is the quality of the presentation there. I mean, and what is the quality of the website that it's being presented on? Is the website on which it resides in line with the principles of trusted publishing? If yes, you can pretty much trust that. But yeah, in case of emergency, you can always rely on PubPeer. And other than that, you just need to rely on your gut instinct. Is this paper, well presented? Are the conclusions in line with the results? Is just an evaluation that you have to do yourself and try to understand that paper. Of course, it's a lot of work to try to understand all the references that you're using, but you should try to do that in order to better substantiate the subsequent questions that you will be asked during the peer review process.
Okay. There are a few different questions that have come through pertaining around these emails that we will sometimes receive from time to time in our inbox. And I will echo you, Flavian. I think you mentioned you get quite a few. I get quite a few that come through about publisher's notes that I might have had to publish, pertaining to a correction or something in one of the journals that I've worked with. And I would say, I think you gave some great tips in terms of things to go back and check for, specifically around the websites. But in terms of actually engaging with this comment, my recommendation would be, if you suspect something is off and you've checked out the website and something still seems off, don't engage with the message at all, is typically the recommendation we give. Flavian, is that true in your experience as well? Or do you have any other tips or things that you're highlighting when you look at these emails?
Yeah, well, when I look at these emails, first of all, I look at who signs them. Usually it will just be a first name of a person who I cannot identify, so it's just signed by Sunny. Okay, well, if it's signed by Sunny and that's all, I obviously will disregard this message. And second of all, you should be wary of emails that entice you to submit like everything you have in terms of what may qualify as fringe research. I mean, a comment of whatever, if it's not even asking you for a full scientific article, you'll have to ask yourself, what is the value of giving just bits of information or comments on a paper? I don't see really any value in that for your portfolio as authors.
And I think the other thing that has come up that is maybe a little bit related to this comes around the idea of payment and membership. I think oftentimes winds up being either very unclear from the start that you would be asked to pay money to be able to publish. And sometimes that is also unclear on their websites as well. By comparison, on all of our journal websites, if it is an open access journal, we are very upfront with this is the fee pending
Yeah,
acceptance of your
exactly.
of your manuscript. So I think that's something to look out for, but also this idea of memberships and kind of statements where you can publish as many articles in a year as you want if you pay this membership fee. That raises some alarm bells on my end. Um,
Yeah, definitely. Not something. I don't know how this wholesale publishing idea works. I mean, you shouldn't be published for your wholesale output. You should be recognized for each of your individual contributions, and each of them should be evaluated transparently or incomprehensively on their own merit, and not be enticed to just send us everything you have in your folders, and we'll just publish them.
Okay, we've got a great one here, which spreads maybe a little bit beyond predatory, but something that we deal with on a frequent basis, Fabian, around the idea that journals that publish many special issues could be considered possibly predatory. So, do you want to comment more broadly on special issues? Because I don't think we can make that direct correlation between being a journal that frequently publishes special issues as being predatory, but some of the ways that special issues have been manipulated, in particular by paper mills.
Yeah, it's so broad. I mean, this affected the issue of special issues. I have to be honest, it affected trusted publishers a lot. Of course, it's also equally recognizable in predatory journals, but it has gotten to such an extent that I think it was the Swiss National Science Foundation decided to no longer condone the publishing of content in open access special issues. So we do recognize this as a global problem. Elsevier, I think, for its part, is trying to be transparent in the handling of any subsequent issues that may have arisen in relation to these special issues. I think there is a risk in this sense, but I don't think you can put you can pinpoint what exactly is the problem here. You can't really label a journal as being predatory just because it publishes a lot of special issues. I think that's difficult, but we do recognize that a lot of journals that publish special issues, even trusted journals, have seen a lot of pushback from the community and from funding agencies because of the misconduct that was discovered in relation to these special issues.
And maybe just a wider note, on paper mills and some of these paper mill hallmarks and strategies, since we have the opportunity to also educate on this as well. Paper mills are basically end-to-end services that are provided to authors, and they will oftentimes have a centralized email address. They'll pose as a corresponding author on a paper, submit that paper into a journal, and then once that paper, either based on real data or based on completely fabricated data, makes it through to peer review, they then go out and solicit authorship, typically on social media or through some of these clever marketing campaigns and email campaigns that some of you may have received. And at that point, authors would pay for a position on a paper. And at the point of revision is when we start to see a lot of these changes in authorship coming through. We've also seen some citation manipulation happening as well, and also the manipulation of those special issues in kind of paying and working directly with guest editors to manipulate that peer review process. So this is tangential to predatory publishing, and I think sometimes paper mills can use predatory journals as a vehicle for kind of perpetuating their business model and their success. So there are other concerns out there that we also want to make sure that you guys are aware of. You know, there are some questions that come through in terms of editor responsibility and how do we make sure that, you know, we do our part to uphold these standards. And I think, you know, similar to the webinars that we're hosting for all of you here today, you know, we also do a fair amount of outreach back to our editors so they're aware not only of their responsibilities as an editor to uphold a fair and unbiased peer review process, but that they're also aware of some of these different pitfalls that may happen along the way, some of the different types of integrity issues that we're seeing as a whole. So that way we can make sure that, you know, we are doing our best to, you know, inspire that trust and transparency in the content that comes out of our journals. And obviously when we do recognize an issue, you know, to make sure that we're correcting the record as quickly as possible. So I just wanted to cover that as a slight tangent but I think it covered a couple of other questions that have come through in this Q&A as well. And I think there's questions as well about the,
Well, you know, I should mention, you know,
Good.
although I think that screening for paper mill hallmarks is perhaps the single biggest thing in which Elsevier has invested in terms of screening for ethics issues in order to make sure this doesn't happen. We understand that paper mills are essentially unfair competition to honest authors. I mean, honest authors, you know, can feel pretty let down maybe by the system, by the fact that these paper mills proliferate the way that they do, and we are developing resources and we're investing a lot in catching these things before they get published so that we don't have to retract them later. And if we do find them later, we will retract them, you know. But it's exactly the sort of unfair competition that I feel authors are getting from paper mills that we're getting from predatory journals. You know, it's the same thing, but on one hand, we can't do anything about predatory journals other than, you know, have these little chats once in a while with the community. But we can do a lot about paper mills, and we are doing a lot, and we are developing advanced tools to catch them. And, you know, this is perhaps our #1 priority at the moment.
Mm-hmm. And along those lines, we have a question in here around different initiatives that might be happening across the scientific community to help detect predatory journals. And I think we could probably expand that question to research integrity as a whole. And you've mentioned the Committee on Publication Ethics, COPE. Flavien, do you want to give a little bit of guidance on some of the resources that are on COPE's website and a quick overview there? And then we can also mention, I believe, the STM Association work that Elsevier also participates in.
Yeah, so, you know, there are various bodies. I think what's nice on the COPE website is that they have these very nice flowcharts that will present how ethics allegations should be handled should they arise, and how an editorial office should be organized. You know, if you look on the COPE website and search for the organization of an editorial office, this is an extremely neat document, and it's not short, but it's as short as it can be, that details of what it takes to have an editorial office that can be trusted. And, you know, when you see all those check marks that they have there, then you really have to then you really can ask yourself, you know, is the journal that I'm submitting to, do they check all these marks? You know, because it seems to be a lot here, you know, in terms of transparency on the guidelines, in terms of ensuring proper peer review, in terms of being able to check on your editors once in a while and to take action. You know, there's a lot there. And I certainly encourage every one of you to look at these documents and to familiarize yourself on on the high standard that is expected of a trusted publisher in order to qualify for this distinction, as you might call it.
The other organization that we partner with quite heavily is the STM Association. So I'm attempting to drop that link into the Q&A associated with the question at hand. And within the STM Association, they have some great resources as well, broadly on research integrity, even in terms of things like image manipulation and the like. But they also have a lot of times different webinars and resources that you can also use to help educate yourself on some of these broad scope topics, and to gain some additional guidance as well. So definitely another site to look at. Flavian, there's a bunch of questions
Yeah, I see
around
them.
you're scrolling through this too. Fantastic. So you'll help me figure out which ones I've attempted to answer. I think a lot around this indexation service, and can we just use Scopus or Web of Science? And if a journal is appearing on one of those two lists, is it fairly safe to say that that is a reputable journal? I think you addressed this, but maybe we can
Yeah,
just clarify on it.
Web of Science, the trust, ultimately the trust in what we do will come down to the funders. Do they trust this model? I have to say, the peer review publishing has received some share of criticism. I've heard people say, but Einstein didn't publish in peer review journals, but that was a while ago. Ultimately, the peer review model gained traction and trust because the funders trust this model. This is the model that they trust, and this is the model that they invest in. And these are the principles that funders expect publishers to uphold. It didn't get enforced on researchers. I mean, why do we have to publish like this? This is something that developed in time, and it became the de facto model because the people who are in charge in deciding what policies are in terms of scientific research, this is the thing that they trust most. And ultimately, the metric provided by Web of Science, the impact factor, is still the golden standard that everyone follows, and because of that, Clarivate sort of holds journals to the highest standard in deciding whether they are trustworthy or not. So yes, the fact that a journal has an impact factor in Web of Science or is indexed in one of its databases is, I would say, a pretty recognizable indication of its trustworthiness. Absolutely, Scopus as well. It's a you know I won't mention Scopus again. It's a bit of a conflict of interest because it's owned by Elsevier, but they are very good. These are very good indexation services that I trust absolutely.
And I think those services are also doing regular reviews of their content
Oh
as
yeah,
well. Especially with things like even top stated researchers, and where some of those profiles have been associated with ethical misconduct, they are reevaluating kind of those top lists. So I do think that they are also very much aware of these different types of misconduct that are happening, and doing their best to make sure that the lists that they're providing are can remain trusted by
yeah.
the community at large.
The simplest question is there a single and precise step for authors to recognize a journal as predatory? No, there isn't one. I'm sorry. And there was also a slide in my presentation. Maybe I should have said more, but there is a spectrum of predatory practices. There's not predatory or not. Some journals do a better job at ensuring ethical conformity, and some don't. And there's better cases and worse cases of predatory publishing, if I can call it that way. But what ultimately defines predatory publishing is the intent of a publisher to mislead submitting authors. Some journals may be delisted or sanctioned by indexation services because they failed in some way to uphold the ethical standards that was expected of them. But many of them had no intention to fail in the first place, and there are failures of the editorial office for various journals. But for most of them, it will not be the intention to mislead authors, to dupe them. into giving away their content to them. This is what really differentiates a predatory publisher. And that's why there's no single foolproof criteria to identify one, unfortunately.
Okay. There's a question about ORCID registration, and I appreciate that there may be challenges around ORCID registration, and I've tried to drop in their help center link for you in case that helps. But I did think maybe, Flavian, it might be good for us to just comment quickly on this idea of identity validation and kind of how ORCID can be used to
Yeah,
help with
so ORCID for some reason gave some trust. There are many websites where you can register as a researcher and post the reviews that you've done and post the articles that you've published and stuff like that to sort of gain an aggregate of your activity as a scientist in participating in the community. For some reason, ORCID is the best of them. It's the one that Elsevier recognizes, and that's why you can use your ORCID ID to authenticate yourself, for instance, on Elsevier submitting websites. So ORCID, we use that sort of as a tool to check on the activity of researchers, and we trust the data that ORCID provides. We would like to get as much as possible a hold of an author's true identity, and to sort of, many social services do this, like they give you blue check marks if you pay for them, or or otherwise. We also try to do this with the utmost respect to an author's privacy. We cannot coerce an author to give away their privacy. We respect the privacy, and we respect existing laws in, like GDPR, in preserving the data of that author, and ultimately in we respect their decision on limiting the amount of information that they allow us to have on them. Absolutely.
Okay, there's a great series of questions right here around kind of the impact on kind of research career if you do fall prey and wind up publishing with a predatory journal. How might that impact your career or your ability to submit other papers? And then tied to that also, if you have submitted it to a predatory journal and you're trying to get that paper back, or and to be able to resubmit it to a more trustworthy journal, what kind of options are on the table? So I think these are really loaded questions, and maybe a good place to kind of wrap up, looking at the time as well. Thoughts, Flavian?
Yeah. So I'm looking at the question here. So it's a very good question. There are some documents, guidelines that will tell you, well, if you publish in this journal, you can do, in the predatory journal, you can do this and this and this. I'll be real, you probably won't be able to do much. That's why we're having this webinar, to try to raise awareness to this fact, because once you've published in a predatory journal, more often than not, you won't be able to retract that paper. But what I would say, if you realize that you were duped in publishing in a predatory journal, it's not the end of the world if you learn something from it, and it's sort of an isolated incident. If you continue to do it and you build your career on that, that becomes problematic. In every case, I would advise anyone who has published in such a journal, if you submit your application somewhere, you can be transparent about this, like mention in your resume or whatever, that I tried to retract this paper, but the journal wouldn't allow me. Anyone will appreciate this sort of disclosure. The fact that you can disclose these things will always be appreciated by a trusted institution or a trusted journal, or whoever. It's true that many editors, even from Elsevier, if you published in a preprint, they will allow it. So Elsevier has no problem publishing papers that have already appeared as preprints. It does not consider this as plagiarism. However, if you've published in a predatory journal, you should mention this in a cover letter. When you submit your paper, you should say to the editor, I've published this work already here, but they wouldn't retract it. Please consider my paper. I'm not saying it's going to work, but it's your best shot at making it work. Be transparent about it, and it's very unfortunate. I never published in a predatory journal, so I was lucky with that. I understand that some people may not be as lucky, and the best thing to do is to be transparent about it, and to minimize damage by not continuing down that path and learning something from the experience.
Yeah, I would say if you do fall into that trap once. And, I think when we look at authors and kind of author profiles, it's that repeated offense. Right. So everybody it can make a mistake, right? We are all
Absolutely.
human beings. And so I think, again, that's where that transparency component comes into play. Certainly, but I don't want you to think that one mistake, by any means will preclude you from having a successful research career or publication career. It is just important to kind of acknowledge it, be open and transparent where you can, and try to prevent those mistakes from happening. If we see those repeat, um, you know, uh, issues coming through, again, it's just something that's going to be looked at with a lot more scrutiny, because we have a responsibility to make sure that the content we're publishing is as trustworthy as we can validate during the peer review process.
Yeah, so there are many journals, many questions, sorry, that people have identified journals as predatory. What can you do with this information? If you're in the position of a librarian or a university or an institute, you don't have to be a funder. You can be an institute. You can tell your employees, please, these journals present risk. Do not publish in them. And there are institutions and countries who have labeled certain publishers as predatory, and they tell their researchers, you're not going to get money to publish here, and if you publish here, you're not going to, this will do nothing for your tenure. You're not going to increase your chances to be promoted or to get a better position at the university. And regarding another question, some journals are labeled unfairly as predatory, are branded as predatory. What can you do about this? You can do nothing about this. Anyone, it's Wild West. Anyone can publish these things over the internet. If they are defamatory without reason, you can certainly ask for the respective websites to take down that information. So if it's libelous information and something on which you can threaten legal action, then you should do that, and you should protect your journal, if it was labeled as predatory in a non-warranted way.
Thank you very much, both. Thank you. That has been a fantastic, very engaging Q&A. So thank you very much for submitting your questions, and Flavian and Angela for answering most of the questions, or as many as you could during this time. So unfortunately, we are out of time. Thanks again for the questions and engagement, and please feel free to share any questions you might still have on the Researcher Academy webinar page, or you can tweet us or message us on Instagram, where you'll find us at Researcher Acad.